Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, feeling watched? What if your nightmares weren't dreams at all but memories, buried deep by something that didn't want to be remembered? Tonight, we step into the mind of a man who was taken not once, but again and again. A man who saw visions of Earth's destruction, of a machine feeding on our emotions, of beings not from above, but from beyond. He was shown a choice between the people he loved, and the fate of the world. What would you choose? This is not a story of abduction. This is a story of transformation. Of a truth so large, it tears through the fabric of reality. And once you've heard it, you will never look at the stars the same way again. They came to the woods for peace. Whitley thought isolation would clear his mind, let him write again, reconnect with Anne, and give Danny a chance to run freely beneath real trees. The cabin stood in a valley of silence, too silent, he would later say. No birdsong. No wind through the trees. Even the air felt wrong, like something was pressing down on it from above. The first night, the fire crackled strangely, not warm, but thin and flickering, as if afraid to be too loud. Anne hummed an old song while unpacking, but her voice felt distant, as though the cabin absorbed sound like a sponge. Danny stared at the window far too long for a boy his age, saying he saw something move between the trees. Whitley laughed then, but his smile was tight. That night, as they all slept, something shifted. It wasn't a sound, but an absence of it, like the forest held its breath. The room dimmed without cause. The moonlight outside the window flickered unnaturally, not blocked by clouds, but by something gliding silently overhead. Whitley stirred. Something was wrong. He opened his eyes, and the world had frozen. The ticking clock had stopped. Not broken, just waiting. The shadows in the room had thickened, lengthened. And then he realized he could not move. His limbs were locked in place. Not by weight, but by will, as if an unseen force had pressed pause on his body. He tried to call for Anne, but his mouth wouldn't respond. Only his eyes darted wildly, searching for reason, for logic. And then they appeared. Not from the door, not from the window. They were simply there. Tall, thin, almost elegant in their stillness. Their skin was pale like moonstone, their limbs too long, too calm. But it was the eyes, those vast, black, depthless eyes, that paralyzed something deeper than his body. They weren't looking at him. They were looking through him. There was no voice, yet words bloomed inside his skull like a thought not his own. You have been chosen. The message wasn't in English, but in emotion, a feeling carved into his bones. A recognition, like he'd heard it before in dreams he'd forgotten. His breath came shallow. Time itself began to feel strange, not passing, but pulsing. Behind the beings, the air shimmered faintly, a thin wall of vibrating light like heat above asphalt, forming a silent doorway that led to somewhere he could not name. A coldness seeped into the room, but not from temperature. It was the cold of knowledge, the sudden, aching awareness that he was utterly powerless, and something far greater than him now stood inside his home, inside his life. A thin metal object hovered beside one of the beings, rotating slowly, humming with a tone too low for ears but felt in the chest. His vision blurred. Something touched his forehead, not a hand, but presence, like 1,000 memories trying to enter at once. The pressure behind his eyes became unbearable. And then, nothing. He woke up with a scream that wasn't his. Anne was holding him. He was soaked in sweat. Danny was crying in the hallway. Whitley looked around. No beings, no light, no sound. Only silence. The kind of silence that waits for something to return. The city lights didn't bring comfort. If anything, they made things worse. Whitley sat in his study for hours, staring at blank pages. His thoughts came in bursts, scattered and broken. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, blinding white light, a ceiling made of shifting silver plates, cold metallic tools hovering in midair without wires or hands, and above all, the eyes. Always the eyes. Massive, black, silent, impossibly still eyes, watching, recording, reflecting. And sometimes, whispering. But not with sound. He couldn't explain it, not to Anne, not to himself. At night, he would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, convinced that he had just fallen from the ceiling onto the bed. His body trembled, not from cold but from something deeper, a memory clawing its way to the surface, begging to be seen, to be felt, yet too terrible to face. Anne tried to be patient, but worry carved itself into the lines of her face. She found him standing in the kitchen one morning, unmoving, his coffee overflowing onto the floor, eyes wide, whispering something about metal halls and the buzzing light. Danny, once playful and loud, had grown silent. He began waking in the middle of the night, drawing shapes that neither parent recognized, circles inside triangles, eyes with no pupils, symbols etched so precisely it was hard to believe they came from the hands of an 8-year-old. Whitley once found a drawing stuffed under Danny's bed. It showed a long silver room, and in the center, a figure lying on a table. Above the figure hovered 3 beings with spindly arms and hollow heads. Danny didn't remember drawing it. He only said, "They told me not to forget." Reality began to feel thin, like a page about to tear. Whitley avoided mirrors. Sometimes, he swore his reflection blinked a moment too late. Street lights flickered when he walked under them. Clocks slowed down in certain rooms. His phone rang, but no one was on the other end, just a low-frequency hum, almost musical, almost familiar. It wasn't just paranoia. Something had followed them home. He couldn't take it anymore. With Anne's hesitant support, he went to see a hypnotherapist, Dr. Rossner, a calm woman who had dealt with trauma victims for years. She didn't laugh at his fears. She listened. Then she put him under. What came next was not a dream. He was floating. His body was weightless, cold, yet untouched. The blue light wasn't above him anymore, it was him, inside him, pulsing through his veins like a second bloodstream. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the hum, that same hum from the cabin, now louder, alive, ancient. Then came the room, a circular space without corners, its walls shimmering like water, filled with a soft white glow that had no source. A platform hovered in the center. On it, he saw himself. He was lying down, naked, motionless, eyes wide open but unseeing. Around him, the grays moved without urgency. They examined, they probed, they scanned. Their movements were methodical, distant, like scientists observing a specimen they had seen 1,000 times before. But then, something else entered the room. It did not walk, it glided, or rather, the room shifted to let it in. Taller than the others, its body was covered in a carapace that glistened like obsidian. Its limbs were too many to count at once. Its head elongated, twitching slightly with every movement, as though it saw time differently. Its eyes were not black like the others. They were multicolored, swirling, hypnotic. And they held age. This being wasn't just advanced, it was ancient, older than memory, older than language. And from it came not speech, not emotion, but weight. the pressure of existence itself. It stared at him, and Whitley felt something rupture inside, like a dam holding back every fear he had ever denied. His heart pounded against his ribs, not in panic, but in recognition this thing had been there before. Not just last week. Not just last year. Always. Watching. Waiting. Choosing. And then it moved closer. Its many limbs unfolded around him, not to hold, but to trap. One limb reached out, touched his forehead not with pain, but with memory. And suddenly, Whitley was seeing everything. 1,000 other rooms. 1,000 other people. Screaming. Silent. Awake. Asleep. Children. Elders. All of them visited. Examined. Marked. He saw Earth floating in space covered in a faint grid of energy. He saw machines buried under ice. He saw lights entering temples long forgotten. And he saw himself again and again, a boy, a man, an old man, always waking in terror, always chosen. He screamed. Not with his mouth, with his mind. And the being leaned closer, and whispered something in a voice not made of sound but time itself. Then he woke. And he remembered. He begins to remember not just the cold, the lights, the silence, but the presence of something watching him from behind, the experience itself, as if the tests were never the point, but only the beginning of something deeper. He's lying on a table, body weightless, nerves wide open, and yet his fear has dulled. In its place comes a new sensation, like his mind is being pulled outward, stretched far beyond his skull. Then comes the questioning, not in words, not in thoughts, but in visions burned straight into his consciousness. He sees Earth from high above, not just in space but in time, flashes of ancient cities, crumbled temples, people screaming beneath dark skies. He sees war erupt like fire tearing through history, nuclear clouds, oceans boiling, forests turned to dust, all happening in loops. Then he sees the suffering, not of individuals, but of entire generations. He watches waves of despair, hunger, grief, and he realizes these emotions are not disappearing. They're going somewhere. A shift occurs, and the vision changes. Now, inside a vast chamber that pulses like a living heart, he sees a towering machine, black, ribbed, humming with something beyond electricity. It breathes, though it has no lungs. It feeds, though it has no mouth. Tubes spiral down from it like roots, touching images of people not real, but representations of billions. The machine is alive. And it is feeding on human emotion. Not just pain, but love, awe, longing. Especially fear. It drinks fear the way lungs drink air. Whitley tries to pull away but cannot. A presence near him, not one of the grays, more ancient, more still, holds him in place. Not physically. With will. It shows him the cycle. They come, they terrify, they watch what you do with the terror, submit, fight, awaken, and through that process, something is harvested. Not blood. Not DNA. Something more elusive, the vibrational echo of the soul under pressure. Later, in the waking world, Whitley walks the streets like a man underwater. His eyes twitch at shadows. His ears catch sounds no one else hears, a low drone beneath the city hum, like metal sighing far beneath the pavement. One afternoon, as he drinks coffee in a half-lit diner, someone sits across from him without asking. A man, older, sharp, with deep eyes that don't blink often enough. He says his name is Eli. He says Whitley isn't the only one. And the moment he speaks, Whitley feels it. This man has seen what he's seen. Eli tells him about a jungle operation gone wrong, decades ago. A bright light that erased radio signals. Men who vanished for hours and came back silent. He tells him about waking up in a hospital with a circular scar on the back of his skull. He shows him a drawing of the same black-eyed beings, the same floating table, the same grid of glowing symbols. Eli says the government knows. Always has. Deals were made. Not all of them honored. Abductions, he says, are not random, they're targeted. They're watching how we evolve under stress. They want something only a few humans can give. Not all aliens agree. Some help in secret. Others just watch. But the experiment continues. Whitley stares at him, unable to speak. The diner's lights flicker once. Outside, the street looks distorted, like heat rising from asphalt, even though it's cold. Eli leans in and says, "They've marked you now. You see more because they let you. But be careful, Whitley. If you see too much, they'll want something in return." And with that, the man leaves. Whitley turns to look, but the chair is already empty. No sound of the door opening. No footsteps. Only a faint echo in the salt shaker glass, humming softly, like a whisper just out of reach. There were no flashes, no warning sounds, no sudden loss of consciousness. This time, he was taken while fully awake. One moment, Whitley was sitting at his desk, writing in silence. The next, he found himself standing in a boundless space where edges no longer existed. The darkness surrounding him was not the absence of light, but a living substance, thick, magnetic, flowing like smoke infused with thought. There was no ground beneath his feet, only the sense of being held in place by an unseen will. In front of him, the grays were gone. In their place stood something else, not quite humanoid, yet radiating a strange feminine energy, calm but all-encompassing. She didn't walk toward him. Instead, distance dissolved. No language was spoken. No echoes filled the void. Yet Whitley understood everything. She told him they were not gods, not rulers, not saviors. They were mirrors. They reflected human fear, desire, and the self-made limits of the mind. When he trembled and asked, "Why me?" the answer did not come in explanation, but in vision of fractured timeline, fragments of his life when he had feared, doubted, stood at the edge of despair. These were the moments of light they had seen from afar. They didn't seek the strong, they sought those who had begun to unlock themselves by walking through the dark. She reached out, or rather, the idea of a hand did, and touched his mind. And then, everything exploded into color and sensation, geometric forms spinning in three-dimensional space, sounds of planets breathing, the presence of millions of life forms vibrating on different frequencies within the same layered reality. And in that instant, he understood humanity was not being controlled. It was being observed, like a seed still waiting to bloom. But if we failed to break free from our illusion, we would collapse just like countless civilizations before us, long gone before any help could reach them. When he woke, the clock on his desk read 3:33. There were no scars. No wounds. Only tears in his eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming truth he had seen. From that night on, everything changed. Not just for him. And began hearing footsteps at night, but no one was ever there. Small objects in the house, spoons, candles, pens, began to move on their own when no one was watching. Danny started drawing spirals endlessly. When Anne asked him what they meant, he simply replied, "The door is about to open." On a moonless night, as the three of them sat eating dinner, a soft violet light appeared from the ceiling. It wasn't bright, but it silenced everything. No clinking of cutlery, no breathing, not even the crackle of air. Time stopped. Or twisted. The paintings on the wall began to melt, slowly. The table trembled. Danny stood up quietly and walked to his bedroom. The door closed behind him without a sound. Whitley and Anne rushed after him, but when they opened the door, the room was empty. Their son was gone. Only a single drawing remained on the bed, a spiral enclosing a tiny human figure, and scrawled in childlike English, "Don't worry, I'm safe. They're showing me the beginning." Danny returned a few hours later, as if nothing had happened. He didn't remember where he had been. But something in his eyes had changed. The light around him felt different. And when Anne held him tightly, trembling, she looked at Whitley with eyes that no longer questioned. Everything he had said was true. And none of them could go back to being ordinary ever again. He was not taken this time, he was summoned. There was no blinding light, no distortion of time. One moment, he was lying in bed beside Anne, her breathing slow and steady. The next, the room was gone. He stood in an endless expanse that wasn't space, nor sky, but something in between. A fluid void that pulsed with thought. Above him, stars flickered not with light, but with memory. Each pulse a whisper, each glow a distant scream. He wasn't alone. They surrounded him not physically, but perceptually. Shapes, beings, echoes of sentience. He couldn't count them. Some shimmered like flame held underwater. Others existed only as a feeling in his bones. And one stepped forward, the female presence, the one who had touched his mind. Her form wavered between familiarity and impossibility. This time, she did not show him visions. She placed him inside one. He was back on Earth, but not the one he knew. Cities were burning. Ash filled the sky. Rivers ran thick and dark. He stood on a cliff, watching the collapse of civilization. Machines lay broken. People screamed, but their mouths made no sound. And floating above it all, he saw the machine, the living one, feeding silently on fear, despair, and grief. He heard a voice, not hers, but many, layered over each other like chords of forgotten music. This is one path. You must choose another. Then came the trial. He was in a room. Not the metallic craft this time, but something more symbolic: white walls, a long table. On one side sat people he loved, and Danny, his parents, even versions of himself from younger years. On the other side, sat strangers, wounded, lost, afraid. And then the question, not spoken, but pressed into his soul like molten truth. Who will you save? Time froze. He tried to speak, to reason, but words crumbled. The beings watched not his mouth, but his heart. Every fear, every hesitation, exposed. If he chose his family, he would lose the world. If he chose the world, he would lose himself. And as the pressure built, his mind began to fracture. He dropped to his knees. His memories spilled around him like broken glass. The woods. The lights. The dreams. The machine. The child inside the machine. He wept not from pain, but from clarity. There was no choice to make. Only a truth to accept. That fear was never the enemy. It was the doorway. And in that moment, everything changed. The room shattered. The beings dissolved. The trial ended. And he stood once again in the void, but now it was filled with color, warmth, harmony. The female presence returned, but she was no longer separate. She was inside him. Around him. Through him. You are not a prisoner. You are a bridge. He saw Earth again not as a planet, but as a becoming, a living consciousness evolving towards something greater. He saw thousands of others like him, each touched, tested, transformed. They were scattered across the globe, hidden, silent, waiting. Together, they formed a net of awareness, ready to awaken something ancient in the human soul. When he returned to his body, it was morning. And watched him quietly. She knew. She didn't ask. Danny stood by the window, drawing spirals in the fog of the glass. The house felt quiet but not empty. The silence was filled with meaning now. He sat at his desk, opened a notebook, and began to write. Not for fame. Not for proof. But because the message was no longer his alone. And as his pen moved, he heard a whisper once more. Communion is not contact. It is remembrance. And he remembered. He was no longer just a witness. He became a bridge between fear and understanding, between humanity and what waits beyond. But the question remains. What were they truly after? Was it our fear, or our awakening? Do you believe his story? Or, have you felt something like it, deep in your own memory? Tell us what you think. Have you ever had a moment that made you question everything? And if you thought this was strange, wait until you hear what happened to the woman who disappeared, and came back speaking a language no one had ever heard before. That's next. Subscribe. Stay awake. The Alien Storyverse has only just begun.